here to give you glory. There's no one like you. There's no one who loves us with an everlasting love or draws us with loving kindness like you do. There's no one who has the power to heal. There's no one who can know our hearts and our thoughts and love us in spite of. No one like you. So we are here to give you all the glory and praise. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So Rebekah asked me to just share a little summary of the disease. Not really all about breast cancer, but kind of a little bit about her story and how things progressed. And I just want to start with the verse that filled my mind pretty continuously through all of this was, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me," in the 23rd Psalm. Often, you know how you have to break down a text, and that one is pretty easy. We've known it a long time, you know, but I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. It's powerful. And so Rebekah's situation, she started in February of 2021. She awoke one morning, just Sabbath morning actually, with abrupt, strange change in one breast. Wondering, like, how did I not notice this? You know, so distinctly different. And, you know, she is in her early 30s and she didn't have a doctor and didn't need a doctor. She wasn't at an age yet for mammograms or anything like that. So after the weekend goes by and she sees there's a doctor in their church, but of course she wanted to go to a female. So she went to see his nurse practitioner in February. The ultrasound was done, and it looked like maybe there was a cyst draining. It was kind of nondescript, but they said it looked like maybe a draining cyst, and they put her on antibiotics and said, if it's not better in 3 months, come back. So I'm going to tell you kind of like about what her diagnosis was at first, but the cancer she actually had, we didn't know that this diagnosis until August. But the cancer she actually has is inflammatory breast cancer, and it's a rare breast cancer. It accounts for about 1 to 5% of breast cancers, and it is very different. I'll tell you some more about it, but it's not usually picked up on ultrasound or mammogram, and it doesn't cause a lump, and you don't have pain. So the American Cancer Society, you know, in medicine we don't usually use the words always or never. But on the American Cancer Society website, when it talks about inflammatory breast cancer, it says it is always stage 3 when it's diagnosed. It's always the change in breast that gives the diagnosis. It's sudden and it's very strange. So we had a diagnosis of breast cancer which came in May, at the end of May. But I take us back to February because that was a sudden, stark change, and all of her symptoms fit the description of the inflammatory breast disease. The only other thing like it really is mastitis, so that's why they treated her with the antibiotics, because she had this presentation. So anyway, going ahead to May, she went back for a repeat ultrasound, and at that point it showed a large mass that looked like it had its own blood supply. So when she told us that, then I thought, well, you know, it's going to be cancer. And I felt really bad because I never asked her what kind of symptoms she had in February, and she just told me she had, you know, had an ultrasound and it looked like there was a cyst, and we have a lot of fibrocystic breast disease on my grandmother's side and my mom's side. So I didn't think anything of it, and I didn't ask any questions. So anyway, it was just very bizarre and unusual. So in May, she went back, and the ultrasound report was more differentiated and distinct, so she was scheduled for a biopsy right before Memorial Day weekend, and they did biopsy a lump which showed invasive ductal carcinoma, which is, if you're going to have breast cancer, that's, I would say, maybe a good kind to have, because surgical removal is usually accomplished quite nicely, and they do treat with chemotherapy. They recommend that usually, but you have a pretty good prognosis depending on, you know, if it's not anyplace else. So there was a lump. So now at this time she really had 2 kinds of breast cancer, but probably everything everything that came in the next 10 days on reports came from this inflammatory breast cancer, which is so aggressive that it spreads like wildfire. And keep in mind that she's being diagnosed in May with breast cancer, and her symptoms started in February, and it was already a stage 3. So once we realized those things, retrospectively, it began to make sense, because otherwise we were thinking, wow, how could she have had this for, like a year and we're not knowing or whatever. So she had the biopsy and saw a surgeon, and we were very grateful to look at the possibility of having surgery. And I was thinking, okay, I'll just fly out and help when she gets that scheduled. But first, a CT scan, and then the CT scan showed something in the lungs. And then the MRI, and then each of these reports looked like they probably belonged to somebody else. It was just unimaginable. So the MRI, we got that like within that first week after, and it showed that she had cancer in her bones and in both of her lungs. And by the time I flew out there, she had the bone scan done, and it showed that she had cancer in her face, in her skull, from the eye socket area of the skull, ribs and vertebra, and the femoral head, and the pelvis. And there's a little bone in the pelvis structure that was already broken because of the pathological, the eating away of the cancer. So it looked like you just picked that up off the top of the stack on somebody's desk, and it couldn't be Rebekah's. We couldn't understand that, and that was the middle of June by the time all those things were together, and she was seeing the oncologist. I was looking through my journals, and on this one day I said, Rebekah and Daniel are going to the oncologist. How unreal it is to be using that word in connection with my daughter. But God is so good, and superimposed upon everything from the very start for me was, I kept thinking, I just don't know, Lord, if I have enough faith. If you read in the Bible and over it says, your faith has made you whole. And so if her healing would depend upon my faith, I didn't have that kind of faith for her to be healed. I didn't think I did, but I just kept always praying and always hanging on to these Bible verses and just trusting that God knew best, and that though we were going to walk through this valley of the shadow of death, we were not going to be afraid of death, because it's okay when you're a child of God. It's not what we want, but we don't need to fear any evil. And so I'm going to go ahead and just read a few things about the inflammatory breast cancer. It doesn't look like a typical breast cancer. I told you it doesn't usually cause a breast lump, and it doesn't show up on mammogram. It's difficult to diagnose. Inflammatory breast cancer tends to occur in younger women, younger than 40 years of age. Black women appear to develop inflammatory breast cancer more often than white women. It's more common among women who are obese. So some of these things didn't fit Rebekah, but inflammatory breast cancer tends to be more aggressive. It grows and spreads much more quickly than more common types of breast cancers. It is always at least at a locally advanced stage when it is first diagnosed, because the breast cancer cells have grown into the at least the stage 3 phase. In about 1 of 3 cases, inflammatory breast cancer has spread or metastasized to even distant parts of the body when it's diagnosed. Women with inflammatory breast cancer tend to have a worse prognosis than women with other common types of breast cancer. So the presentation can be swelling or edema to the skin of the breast, redness that involves maybe more than 1/3 of the breast. It's a very, it's really obvious. It's not a little small redness. Pitting or thickening of the skin of the breast so that it might look like an orange peel or feel hard like an orange peel. The nipple can be retracted or inverted, and one breast looks larger than the other because of the swelling. The one breast that's swollen is warmer and heavier than the other. It's because it's like an infection sort of thing. So like you can see how it kind of mimics mastitis in that way. It looks like it's an angry infection. The breast can be tender, painful, or itchy, and the swelling of the lymph nodes under the arms or near the collarbone can be noticeable by the time you realize that you have it. So very poor prognosis, 3 to 6 months if not treated immediately with the recommended chemotherapy. And so keep in mind, we were February, March, April, May, and then she really started chemo July 12th, 13th, July 13th. So she was, not just because of the prognosis, what it says, but she was very close to her demise. So go ahead, Miss Rebekah, dear.
Thanks, Mom. So, I shouldn't have made it through even July of 2021. So, when we got the very first biopsy result, which said invasive ductal carcinoma, what they call the old lady's cancer. It's slow growing, it's easy to just have the surgery. If you get a doctor who's really wanting to treat it aggressively, then they're gonna try to send you for chemo and radiation, but that's much easier to deal with, that particular kind of cancer. But even with that initial diagnosis, just sitting there seeing it in print was like a punch to the gut. And my brain was not even processing. And so I know it wasn't my brain that remembered something. It was the Lord reminding me. And at that minute, I remembered a story I had read, and I'm sure most of you have as well. It's a story, you can find it in Great Controversy. I know you can find it other places too, because it's a documented story about the reformer John Wycliffe in England hundreds of years ago. And the story is that he got deathly ill, and everyone thought he was going to die. So officials, both secular and religious, gather around, and the monks are like, you need to make your final confession and apologize for all the evil you have said against us. And Wycliffe sat up with help, and he looked at them and he said, I shall not die but live and continue to declare your evil works. And I thought, well, Lord, that's not quite fitting here. But I said, I know he was quoting a Bible verse, paraphrasing a Bible verse. And so I went and looked it up, and I wanted to share it with you. It's Psalm 118, verse 17. Sorry, I hit 119, and you know how long that one is. Psalm 118, verse 17. And the verse says, I shall not die but live and declare the works of the Lord. Amen. And I that verse became my lifeline. Amen. And that's what tonight's about, honestly, is the only reason I'm alive is because God did this. Amen. And so tonight we wanted to declare just a little bit of the works of the Lord. But as this unfolded, as we began to realize just what the devil had concocted here, and we don't want to give honor to what the devil did, but you can't understand the depth of what God did until you see the monster that the devil created, and that's the thing with paintings, with artwork, whether it's sculptures or drawings or whatever. The dark contrast adds depth, adds beauty to the brightness, to the picture. It adds definition and clarity. And so that's why I wanted Mom to share with you guys just how big and how impossible this was. So that what God does next is even more beautiful. So there was a lot of sleepless nights during that treatment. It hurt too much to get out of bed and do anything, and I, so laying there in bed, talking to the Lord, and I really struggled. I knew the Lord had brought this verse to my mind, but I struggled with, Lord, is it presumptuous of me to claim this, to claim this, that I shall not die but live. Because what if it would bring you more glory if I died? And so I struggled with faith versus presumption. And finally, the Lord helped me realize that it's not presumptuous to claim something he has given. And it's also not presumptuous to claim a promise that he will bring glory to himself or strengthen the faith of someone else. Amen. Because stories were starting to come in very early on, but all throughout, stories were beginning to come in. I think of one gentleman who was a classmate of one of my sisters, and she had recently reconnected with him, with several of the classmates, and she was about my situation and asked for prayer. And this classmate had been raised a pastor's child. And he told my sister later, he said, I haven't prayed in years. Oh my. And you're asking me to pray for your sister. He goes, but recently I've been feeling like maybe I should give God one more chance. Wow. He said, so I'm going to pray for your sister. Wow. And I'm going to give God this one more chance. Wow. And I said, Lord, no pressure. And he said, it's no pressure on you. Oh, right, okay. And all you have to do is read a few chapters in the Gospels and it's no pressure for him either. And that's just one story. My oncologist, I was out in Oregon at the time. My oncologist was from Turkey. And I don't know that he was Muslim, but I do know that every time I would mention the Lord, he would try hard not to roll his eyes. And we, from the very beginning, said, we were open with him, and I said, I would like to I would like to include some alternative treatments as well to help supplement, because I realize, if I don't get the chemo, I'm going to die. You deal with what you have to deal with. But I need to strengthen my immune system as well. I need to do all these other things. How open are you to me including some of these? And he said, no. And then he said, well, if you want to smoke marijuana, that's okay. I said, Lord, should I get a different oncologist? And he said, no. And I said, okay, this is going to be an uphill battle every time. I don't know that I have the energy for this, but the Lord said, leave it with me. Amen. And so those are just two stories. I'll tell you more later if we have time, but I tell you what, as this doctor saw the lab results every week, and I was open with it, I'm taking all these extra supplements, and I called them supplements. I didn't tell him that, the extra turmeric and all all these things. I didn't explain to him. I just labeled them under supplements. That'll be the easiest way for him to understand it. He's like, well, if anything changes with your lab work, we'll have to get rid of that. And promise me, do not take intravenous vitamin C. Well, we had talked with Dr. Nedley, and he had said that it's not good for breast cancer. And I told the oncologist, I said, I can promise you, I will not be taking intravenous vitamin C without your telling me to. I can promise you that one. And he took it and we went on. But as things progressed, and every time he would look at my lab work, and then he'd look at me and he'd be like, what about your pain levels? And I tell you, at the beginning, it was excruciating. And like Mom mentioned, one of the bones in my pelvis had already broken because the cancer had eaten through it. And there were other, in my spine, the cancer eating away at the bone is excruciating. But I was only on Advil for painkiller. It was no, because I would take 600 milligrams every, whatever it was. Anyway, I was taking it as often as I could, as much as I could, as often as I could. But that was the only pain medicine I was using. And they were amazed, but it still was excruciating. But as the treatment went on, God took a lot of the pain away. Amen. Not every time, but it was on a trajectory of reducing the pain. And the doctor would just shake his head. Are you ready for more pain, stronger pain medicine? Nope. I'm down to twice a day sometimes, or whatever the case was. And he would look at the lab reports, and every time he would tell me, if something changes, we're going to have to stop your supplements. Has anything changed? No. And he'd say, watch these numbers. If they go up too high, we're going to have to stop your other supplements. And I said, okay, how high is too high? Well, they need to have like another 400 points. We're fine, And, it was not a breeze. There were so many challenges, and the neuropathy that came along with it was not fun. And there were so many other symptoms. But at the end of the chemo treatment, that doctor looked at me and said, I have never seen someone respond so well to the treatment. And I looked at him and I said, that's because of Jesus. Amen. That's because of answered prayer. And I said, praise the Lord. And he went, But through this whole thing, as I held on to this verse, I shall not die but live and declare the works of the Lord. When my faith would waver on that, when I would start to question, was I even going to make it to see my next birthday? Even though I didn't say it. The next day, somebody would stop by to bring food for us, and they would say, Rebekah, as we were praying this morning or last night, the Lord just gave us peace that he was going to heal you. Amen. And I was floored. Every time, I don't know why it surprises me, but every time it would just surprise me. And then, it shouldn't surprise me, but the Lord would take those opportunities to remind me that this was a promise he had given me. And one sweet lady told me, she said, God told me to pray something very specific. I said, okay, what? She said, either he's going to heal you entirely or Jesus is going to come before the cancer kills you. I said, you know what? I'm good with that. Oh. Another thing, another lesson that the Lord tried to teach me, and I'm still learning. There was another night, when I couldn't fall asleep because it hurt too bad. And it was just that deep bone ache. When you get the flu and you have that really awful achy bones. Yeah, multiply that a little bit from head to toe and you got it. And I was, my husband's fast asleep next to me, and I knew Mom was asleep in the next room because her light had finally gone off. And I was just talking to the Lord, and I said, Lord, can you give me grace and strength to endure? But can you please take the edge off so I can go to sleep? The next thing I knew, it was 3 or 4 hours later, and I was awakened to the call of nature, and I had had the best sleep I had had in weeks. Amen. And as I crawled back into bed and realized how the Lord had answered what was, in many ways, a very little thing. Here I am fighting something that's trying to kill me, and I'm just asking to be able to have my pain dialed down a little bit. It's apples and oranges, but whatever. And I said, but Lord, thank you. Thank you for answering this little thing. And I heard that still small voice say, Rebekah, I answered the small things to build your faith that I am answering the bigger things as well. Ask me for more. And so I'm going to let Mom take over here and talk about a little bit more on that, asking for more.
if I could, I would ad lib and share. There's so many miracles. You know, when Rebekah had that second ultrasound, that in the one in May, that showed that this was a large mass now with its own blood supply, and I just thought, okay, well, I know it's cancer. And I was just talking to her after the biopsy, but I said, well, are you sleeping okay? And she said, no, I can't sleep because of this pain in my hip. And she had kind of like a bursitis for maybe a year and a half, and we kept, going, where is it? And feeling around, yeah, it's probably bursitis. John checked her, and everything. And all of a sudden I'm like, pain in your hip that you always have? And she said, yeah, because she wasn't differentiating things very well at that point. And she said, yeah. And she said, I just can't sleep because of it. And she was still working. She had 3 jobs and part-time jobs, and she was still working. And I said, well, how is work going? And she said, well, it would be okay, except I have to eat cough drops continuously because of, so that I don't cough. And I said, what cough? And she said, well, I just have this, like sinus issue, this allergy, since I was there. And a couple weeks ago, she had been home. And so as we were talking, I listened, and I heard this little like that a few times. And I said, is that the cough you're talking about? And she said, yeah. And, right away I was thinking, I've heard that cough 2 other times as a nurse, and both times were friends of mine, and both times they died within a month of their onset of really realizing. One time it was Marlene, Marlene Walker, the cough she had. At first it was just seemed like she just had an allergy, Anyway, so before she had the test results, I felt like she has metastasis to her lungs and to her bones, and I was like, no. And John was saying, no, and yet you just can't process how something could go so fast. And she's talking about like having pain at night, but she coughed, and she would start coughing at night, and Daniel would put on the eucalyptus or the spearmint or whatever we were trying, and get the stove boiling and get her out there to breathe. And I would just go pray when there was nothing else to do, or we would rub castor oil. And I was looking back in my journal, and there were like about maybe 10 nights after I had gotten there right in the beginning where she slept, and I was just saying, Lord, thank you, 10 nights that she, slept for a couple hours without this cough, and then it just started back up, and it was so severe that she could say 2 or 3 words and she would start coughing. She would take a hot and cold shower, and the humidity would stimulate the cough, and she would come out and lay on her stomach and cough for 30 minutes before she could stop coughing. And she would start to eat, and she would start coughing. So she would lie back down again until she could maybe come back and eat. Maybe she couldn't. So this was during the end of June and into July, and we were seeing doctors and trying to decide what to do, and already doing the natural remedies that we find, and talk to different people. And God just blessed us so much with different consults that we wouldn't have had if it weren't for God's intervention. Even the National Institute of Health, which came through somebody that Washita, that was one of the faculty, and they had been through a cancer experience and had somebody that they knew on the cancer faculty up there, and his cousin. And so anyway, we just had lots of consults and lots of information that helped us, but she was just progressing so fast, and that fracture in the pelvic area kept her from feeling comfortable sitting up, so she'd stay in bed. And then she had her first chemo treatment July 13th, and she got a fever that night, and if it's above 100.4, you have to go to the ER, which we did. And her resting, when she was asleep, her respiratory rate was 30. And her pulse would be about 120 to 130. That was her resting vital signs.
What's normal?
Well, what's normal is about 16 to 20 respirations a minute, and like 60 to 80 to 100 if somebody doesn't exercise, beats per minute for your pulse. So it was very fast, and that would be when she's not coughing. So when she went to the ER, they thought she had an embolus or a lung clot because of her fast respiratory rate and so forth. So they sent her home and to get a CT scan, which they couldn't do for 5 days, so her doctor got her somewhere else into another system and got that done. But he called us, so this was July, the second week in July, and her other scans had been the first week of June, so about 5 weeks after her first scans. And he called us on a Friday night, and he said, there's no clot in your lung, but I needed to call you because your spine is really deteriorating fast, and you have a fracture at T2, which is kind of up here in the thoracic area. And she said, is that because I'm coughing so hard? She coughed so violently. And he said, it might be, or it could just be pathologic. But he said, I'm calling you because you're in danger of an oncologic emergency of a compression fracture, which will cause paralysis. I don't want you to bend, and I don't want you to lift anything. That was such a dark Sabbath, you know, that news came, and she laid there in bed, and she didn't want to get up anymore. It was in the evening, so it was after our last meal. But the next day, you know, she didn't want to get up and shower. She didn't want to get up and try to eat or anything. And toward the end of the day, I said, Rebekah, you've got to get up. And she said, you know, Mom, she said, 3 of my favorite things, singing, talking, and laughing, I can't do. I can't pray. I can't speak more than a few words without starting that coughing. And she said, you know, now I'm not going to be able to move. And, you know, and her thought was if she's lying down, the mattress supports her better when she coughs than if she gets up. And so she was then terrified to get up and have a coughing spell and be in the shower or something like that where more fractures might occur. And so that was just when the chemo had first started. But I want to say that the Lord gave us 3 ways that I could see that He helped us to decide that we needed to go through with the chemotherapy. And they were miraculous things as well, because there were a lot of struggles trying to make that decision, you know, and knowing what you're going to go through, because it's going to be hard on your system and everything. But one of them I'll tell you about, we had seen an intergrational oncologist who is somebody they try to use. Sometimes they do use the routine, the chemotherapy and stuff, but they try to use other alternative things like dietary changes and things like that. So this lady was so sweet, and Rebekah's eating cough drops, so she had no way of knowing how much Rebekah coughed. But she said, well, before you start chemo, and she was supposed to start chemo the next day, and she said, before you start chemo, I want you to go to Pittsburgh, because there's a doctor in Pittsburgh who's doing the study, and if you're on the chemo, he can't do it, but you need to go before you start the chemo. She said they'll take out your T cells, because your T cells aren't recognizing the cancer anymore. They're not fighting against it. They take out your T cells, they reprogram them. It takes 4 to 6 months, and then they'll put them back in. But you have to get them taken out first, and then you could start the chemo. And I was listening, and I thought, she can't go to Pittsburgh. She can't go 30 minutes. I mean, we were 45 minutes away from home for that consult, and it was hard to just drive that far. But we got in a car, and it was on the East Coast. It was about 10 minutes after 5, and they called the 800 number for that program to see if they could get into the research and at least just leave a message. And meanwhile, I was in the back seat. I thought, I have to get out and walk and cry, because I can't believe that we're even considering this. And so I walked around for 10 minutes and came back, and they were on the phone with somebody. And the man on the phone said to Daniel, he said, sir, if that's your wife coughing, she's coughed at least 25 times in these 10 minutes we've been on the phone. They can't get her into the study for till the end of August. She needs to start her treatments tomorrow, and then check back with us later when she's finished with her treatments. And Daniel hung up the phone, and they said, wow, can you believe that was Dr. Kamala himself who answered the research line after 5 o'clock when the place was closed? And that was the doctor who was doing the study. And he said it, right? He said, if that's your wife coughing all those times, she's got to start chemo tomorrow. So we had several things that happened, and I was just praying, Lord, you have to swing that pendulum one way or the other so we can know, because she was losing ground so fast. But Rebekah was asking for me to share about asking for more. During her chemo treatments, again, there are so many things that happened, how the Lord protected her from the ill effects of the chemo. She took her first 2 chemo treatments. They were a week apart, IV chemo. And the third one, her white count was too low. And so they said, we can't give you your treatment today on week 3, and she was supposed to have 12 weeks of chemo. So they skipped that week, and you're kind of like, oh, we want her to get this over with, we don't want to wait and everything. But it occurred to me that very first time that maybe this was the Lord, and I could just trust Him that it was okay. And so on the 4th week, she got the 3rd treatment, and she got another treatment, And then again, when it was time for the next one, that would have been the third in a row, her white count was way too low again, and they couldn't give it. And so I was like, again, but it's okay. So then we were like 6 weeks into it. We should have had 6 weeks of treatment. She only had 4. So they did 2 more, and again, her count was too low. And that time they decided we're going to give her something to make her bones produce the white blood cells faster, and it caused bone pain, which she already had terrible bone pain. And so she would get that, and she would have excruciating pain for 2 days at least afterward, but it made her white count come up, so we didn't miss the third in a row then. And all along, all those treatments, they were saying, do you have any tingling or numbness in your fingers or anything like that? And she'd say, no, no. And when she got 3 in a row, after that, right away, the neuropathy symptoms started. But she already had 4, 5, 6, 7 treatments. They gave her the 8th treatment, and then they said her tingling was everywhere. It was her lips, and she wasn't walking well. She was kind of staggering, and her restless legs were part of it too. And it was awful. And so they skipped a treatment, and then they gave her a lower dose, and the symptoms started to get better when they skipped the treatment. And then when they gave her the lower dose, they started back right away within 24 hours. And that was treatment 10. And at that point, they said, we're not going to do any more treatments because it's not, worth it to get that neuropathy worse than it already was. And, I was thinking then, they know that she doesn't have a good prognosis anyway. And so why keep treating when it's just going to make you have things that are harder to live with. But when she first started the chemo, she did what I thought she did so wonderfully with her chemo. And I used to do chemo treatments for patients at the hospital. I was certified as a chemo nurse, so I knew that, you can have some pretty bad reactions to the medicine. But about the second treatment, she started getting more nausea with it. And the third treatment, she was very sick. And I was saying, when we were in the morning, when we were praying before she had her treatment, I said, Lord, I know that you can help her endure that nausea and help it not to be any worse, And she came back from that treatment that day, and she had no nausea. And so I was telling people that were praying, and my mom and my friend Karen said, we prayed that she would have no nausea at all today. And I thought, again, God is telling us to ask for more, not just, Lord, I know you can help her endure it, but ask him to take it away. And he did over and over answer prayers like that to help us have a greater faith. And so there were others who helped us out. I don't know if you want to share right now and then go to that, or...
Yeah, maybe just pick one of them.
Okay, so there were so many amazing things that happened in the time that Rebekah was going through this out in Oregon. Her half-sister was diagnosed with breast cancer also back here in Nashville, and my stepfather was diagnosed with sarcoma on his foot. The only other person I knew with sarcoma was Hannes, who didn't do very well. And so these other things were going on, but I knew I was where I needed to be. But we were kind of getting on with things toward August. She was starting to do better, so I was starting to think I could come and check on I guess it was September and October, we thought I could maybe come and check on my mom and my stepdad at least. And then her condition would worsen. And one night I was taking a cab to the airport because I had a flight out, and I had to leave their house about 4 in the morning. And her legs were so restless and so bad, it was almost like she was having a seizure. And like her legs were kicking, and she was awake, and I was awake praying with her and everything. So we hadn't had any sleep. At one point, she was nauseated, and she had the basin with her, and she fell asleep. And I kept thinking, I need to go move that basin because she's going to start kicking. And sure enough, she started kicking in her sleep, and the basin went flying. And then she woke up, and she couldn't go back to sleep again. But anyway, after that, I went to catch the cab and go on. I was going to fly out, and I was just had so much turmoil in my heart about leaving her. And in the cab, the man he had a Scottish brogue, long hair, probably 30-ish, And he was real sweet, and he was talking. He said, McEwen, that's a Scottish name. I said, no, it's an Irish McEwen. And so he was talking and talking. He was telling me all about his heritage, his ancestry, and everything. And I kept thinking, I just want to talk about Jesus. I want to tell him about Jesus. And I was just praying and everything. And then he stopped and said something, and I asked him, I said, about a cab coming back from Medford when I returned, and I said something about my daughter and the cancer, and he said, ma'am, do you mind if I stop talking right now and pray for you? And here we were driving in the middle of it was dark, there wasn't much traffic, and we were just like about a 40-minute drive, and he prayed the most beautiful prayer for us, and he said, she did not come out here to bury her daughter. She came out here to watch you heal her. And when I got to the airport then, it was crazy at the airport, and something was wrong with the plane, and they weren't letting us board. And what they said was they booked too many people, and they weren't letting us board until people gave up seats, which was really kind of strange, because usually you get there, and the ones who are there first, you get your seat. But anyway, something was going on, and I was praying, and finally they said, this flight is canceled, so we'll give you a number so you can rebook. And I was like, rebook? I'm going home. And so there was a lady who we had been standing in line to try to ask questions, and I was talking to this lady who had no shoes on. It was funny, and she was really sweet, and she was going to see her daughter in Montana, and she was asking me where I was going, and I was talking about going to see my mom and the things that were happening. And she said, do you know what? She said, this is not about asking a question of that lady who's ignoring us. This is about prayer. So I had the taxi driver prayed with me. I got to the airport, and this lady with no shoes on, who was so beautiful, and she took my hand and she prayed a beautiful prayer for Rebekah and for her healing. And she was a woman of God. She was so precious. So we then later found out that they were canceling the flight, and I walked past her, and I said, I'm going to go down and wait for luggage. And I said, and she was rebooking her flight to see her daughter. She was trying to get a flight for a couple hours later. And I said, I'm just going to go back home. So I went downstairs, and it was quiet down there. And I thought, oh, I don't know how I'm going to catch a cab or whatever, but I'll figure it out. And so I was sitting down there, and here came this blonde, beautiful lady. And she came around. She said, Sherry? And I said, yeah. She goes, how are you going to get home? And I said, I'm just going to get a cab. And she said, no, I'm going to take you. And I said, I don't live in Medford. I said, I live in Grants Pass. She said, I live in Grants Pass. And I said, but aren't you flying out in a little bit? She says, I've got a couple hours and I need to go home. She said, I was barefoot because my shoes were wet. She had her shoes off. She said, my tennis shoes were soaked because it was a downpour when I came in. And so I'm going home to get clean socks and shoes. And I'm going to go, pack some other things. And so I'm going to take you home. And she was a beautiful Christian woman. We had a wonderful visit together on the way. She was so kind. And she lost her car. So when she went to take me out to her car, she said, you just wait here with the luggage and I'll go get it. And she didn't come back for a while. When she came back, she said, I can't find my car. And she said, can I just leave this other stuff with you too? So she had a big kind of a heavier thing, and then she left her purse. And I said, okay. So then I thought, well, I've got her purse, and I took a picture of her luggage tag so I could send her a thank you note, later and everything. And some other people walked out that had been waiting on the plane, and they said, how are you? I said, I'm so blessed. And they said, we are too. And I said, they said, even though we had to rebook a flight. And I said, well, I think it's kind of my fault because I was really needing to not fly out today because my daughter's sick. And they just looked at me and they said, well, we believe that the Lord stopped this flight too. And they left. And it turned out that they knew the lady Stacy. When they were getting their flight later on that day, the couple and this lady were talking. Actually, they knew her brother, and they were talking about Rebekah, and they were talking about me, and they said, we saw that lady. She said that the Lord stopped the flight, and we agreed with her. And so Stacy texted me, and she said, I just want you to know that now the so-and-sos are praying for you. They're friends of my brother, and they go to my brother's church. Anyway, God did so many amazing things like that, and Rebekah just wanted me to share how God used other people to bless us abundantly in this journey. Thank you. There are so many more stories we could tell.
But, and I apologize for the tears. It's kind of hard to tell it otherwise. But, you know, I want to end with this thought. And that is, in our society nowadays, our society is so self-centered. Everything is about me, about people like me, or whatever. And the Lord showed me, because I was, you know, undoubtedly there were things I could have done differently leading up to this that may have prevented the cancer from growing or changed it somehow. But honestly, people asked me afterwards, well, what have you changed in your diet? Not much. Didn't have much more to change, except that the Lord took away my craving for sugar. Yeah. And instead of craving sweets, I was craving fruit. Yeah. And the fruit I was particularly craving were strawberries, blueberries, and peaches. Some of the best for me, and they were in season at that time. And church members were bringing them by the flat load. I mean, it was amazing. But the Lord showed me early on, this cancer was not about me. There was one night I was, again, having a hard time sleeping. You know, things always are harder at night. Always harder at night. And that's when it's easiest for Satan's darkness to block the communication between your soul and your Savior. In the darkness, even easier than it is in the light. And this was one of those times. And the Lord started bringing pictures across my mind's eye of people. He reminded me of these two precious girls whose father was Christian and whose mother was Buddhist. And they're seeing in their home the struggle between mommy's God or daddy's God. And their dad told my husband Daniel, he said, my girls refuse to go to bed at night until they have asked Jesus to heal your wife.
Wow.
And then he reminded me of another little girl I knew and actually became friends with during this experience. And you see the little bear up here, that was a gift from her. And she had a parent telling her that Christianity is a pack of lies. And yet she had fallen in love with Jesus. And so she was 3 when I was diagnosed. And she was asking Jesus to help Rebekah get better and help her hair grow back. So when my hair finally started growing back, I said, see, Jesus is answering your prayer. He reminded me of a relative who had wandered away from God and who through this told me he was praying again.
Amen.
You know, there were so many people, and he started bringing their faces across my mind, including these two precious girls over here. And he reminded me that there are so many people who are watching to see what he does with my situation. People had told me, I had several Romanian friends, and they said, oh, we've asked our family and friends back in Romania to pray for you. And then, of course, my kids in India, the kids that I had worked with over there, they were praying. And I began to realize as I counted on my hands, you know, and then my in-laws, my brother-in-law and his wife were in Thailand, and they said, you know, there's a lot of people who have, almost everybody they talk to in Thailand has at least one family member struggling with cancer. And they said, we've never been able to identify with that part yet. Now, I said, you better milk this for all it's worth. I said, because every time you use this, the devil gets a slap in the face. So you tell those people now, you can connect with them on this because you have a relative with cancer. Use this to build those relationships. But I began to realize there were people praying for me around the globe And there were people who had told us or told people, the stories had gotten back to us of people who had said they were going to give God one last chance based off what he did in my life. There were people who, like the two little girls, who were seeing which God answers prayer better. Which God actually answers prayer, I should put it that way. Daddy's God or mommy's idol, So many situations like this that he kept bringing to my mind. Young people whose faith was just starting to grow. Adults who didn't know if God would still hear them. And I began to realize this cancer wasn't about me at all. It was about them. So when I got up in the morning, I actually made a list. My oncologist, all the people that he had showed me during the night and the ones I could think of in the morning. And from that point on, when the devil would try to discourage me, I would pull that list out and I would lay it and I'd say, Lord, these are the reasons you're going to heal me. These are the reasons. Because this is not about me. This is about them. And it is not presumptuous of me to hold you to your word. Amen. For them. And I realized sometimes God allows things to happen to us he would not otherwise have allowed. But it's the only way he can reach someone I love. It's the only way he can reach someone you love. It's worth it. And it's okay. And even if he had said no to the healing, it still would have been okay. So, current status. My tumor, crying. Current status, my tumors are shrinking or stable. The largest, the lungs are clear. And we realized after that emergency room visit, I actually had pneumonia on top of the cancer in the lungs. Yeah, I should have been gone real quick. So lungs are clear, bones are healing. They don't heal if the tumors are still alive in those locations. So even when I was on the chemo infusions out in Oregon, and my non-Christian oncologist was looking at this going, your bones shouldn't be healing already, but they were starting to heal. With that, he's like, this is incredible. I've never seen this. It's not behaving like it's supposed to. So that's because of prayer. But currently, the last CT scan showed that my tumors are shrinking or are stable. They haven't changed enough to notice. The largest one is now, 2 centimeters, I think it was, or less than 2 centimeters. Whereas prior, the largest one had been 11 centimeters. Yeah. The bones are healing. There's a protein that they measure in the blood that is in some organs in our body naturally produce. And so they say if it's 35 and below, that's considered normal level of what our organs normally produce of this. The cancer that I have mass produces this. So almost exactly 2 years ago, here it is, I had to take a screenshot of it. This cancer marker, they call it, measured 290. The last time they measured it, last month, it was in the low 20s. Wow. They told me it would never drop below the normal level again. It would probably stay just above normal and hover, and they'd call it good. I said, you don't know my Jesus. And so it is well within normal range, which it shouldn't be. But we know the great physician, right? And he's not done yet because it's still going down. So
Sending this oncologist or lab results?
I'm planning to. I haven't yet, but I'm going to. I'm going to print them off and say, look what my Jesus is doing. So, you know, God doesn't always answer this way. We know that. But we know, I heard somebody say years ago, this world is the only heaven that the lost get to enjoy. But it's also the only hell that God's people have to endure. I'll take hell now because Jesus walks through this with us, doesn't he? So whatever, I know each of us is facing something. Know that you're not walking through it alone. I didn't have to walk through this alone. No one has to walk through their valley alone. And know that God is using it for people you haven't even met. People you have no idea of are going to be in heaven because of the valley you're going through right now. It's not about us. It's about him, and it's about growing the faith of those around us, and our own in the process. So, in closing, we have pink for breast cancer, flowers. I'd like for each of you ladies to take some, and we have plenty, so I think, yeah. You all are welcome to take several flowers if you would like, to remind you of what God can do. Shall we have closing prayer? All right. Father, you are amazing. You have done so much for little old me and for so many others. And Lord, thank you. Thank you for walking through the valleys with us. Thank you that we can declare your works. Thank you for continuing to keep me alive like you promised, so that I could declare what you have done for me and my family. Lord, I pray a special blessing on the ladies here and on those whoever will see the recording later. Lord, grow our faith, and may there be souls in the kingdom because of the valleys we're going through right now. Thank you, Father. Be with us as we go home. In Jesus' name.